Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador. Now you probably don't need someone like me to let you know that this new 85mm G Master Mark II is going to be smaller, lighter, faster and sharper than the previous version. Here it is mounted on an Alpha 7C2 compact camera, and as you can see it's not too much larger than the 35mm G Master or one of Sony's smaller compact zooms. So what I am going to do in this particular review is, yes, I will let you know how this has improved from the previous version, but I'm also going to put this in context with a broad range of wide aperture primes to help you choose the best prime for your own workflow. One that will give you the maximum figure ground separation, make your subjects pop from the background and give you a better bit of bokeh. So without much further ado, let's dive in and take a deeper look at this lens. Welcome to my Sony 85mm G Master Mark II lens review. Now this is a long awaited and much anticipated lens. I think I've been waiting for this lens really since 2021, and recently the big speculation of whether this lens would be an f1.4 aperture or an f1.2 aperture, and that question can finally be answered because it is a 1.4 aperture on the Mark II lens. Now this allows me to say this lens again is smaller, lighter, faster and sharper than the previous lens. Obviously if Sony had elected to go for a 1.2 aperture, we wouldn't be able to be saying that this is smaller and lighter because that would add considerable weight. What I like about the 1.4 choice is that it does allow me to engage in low light street photography, as you can see here. A lot of those photographs were captured in very low light in dark alleyways, and that shows the advantage of actually capturing street photography with a wide aperture prime rather than a zoom lens. Now let's roll back the clock to February 2016 when Sony released its first G Master prime, which was that 85mm f1.4 lens. Now if we take a look in 2016, it was a cracking lens to be using back then, and it showed that Sony was quite capable of developing a lens without the help of Zeiss. So this was probably one of Sony's first lenses that really showed that it could perform as well as the Zeiss lenses that it had been using prior to this prime. But in 2017 we also got the 85mm f1.8 lens. Now this did have faster and quieter autofocus than the G Master, and it came in a much lighter form factor. So I found myself using both the 1.4 G Master and also this smaller 1.8 lens because of its faster focus and also when traveling light. Now in 2021, Sigma released their 85mm f1.4 DGDN and really shaved off a lot of the weight from their first attempt at making an E-mount 85mm prime. I have been waiting for Sony to try and match the performance specifications of this Sigma for the last 3 years. Now the focus of this Sigma was a little bit of an improvement over the original G Master, but now of course we have in 2024 the FE 85mm f1.4 G Master II, and what we expect from this lens is to outperform that Sigma. So let's take a closer look. Now the lens has all of the bells and whistles that we expect from a G Master lens, in the fact that it does have an AF/MF switch on the barrel of the lens. It has a custom button. We actually have two custom buttons, so when we're shooting in either landscape orientation or portrait orientation, we do have a custom button right underneath our thumb where we need it. They actually perform the same task. You can't program two different functions to those two different custom buttons. We have the aperture ring, we have an iris lock for that aperture ring, we have a D-click switch if you're shooting movies and you don't want the click stops. We have that 11 blade aperture with the rounded blades, so we get optimum bokeh there. And we have the new linear XD AF motors that we've seen in the fast G Master lenses of late. And as you can see from those features, this does all come in the smaller and lighter form factor with that wide aperture. And we also have a linear manual focus as well. So there's some highlights there, the click on and off switch, the aperture ring and custom button, and the AF/MF switch. We also get that iris lock, so we can wind the aperture ring to the A position, so we can then control the aperture from the camera itself. Now this is very useful if you're doing memory recalls and you've got an aperture programmed into that recall. So obviously if you had the aperture ring turned to a specific aperture, the memory couldn't override that specific aperture on that aperture ring. Sony have been downsizing their zooms and also their primes in recent years, and what we see in this new Mark II 85mm is that it is 22% lighter, down from 1.8 pounds or 820 grams to just over 1.4 pounds, 642 grams. This does make it 0.6 ounce heavier than the Sigma, but basically you're looking at a similar weight and size ratio to that Sigma lens. Now you can see most of the shrinking of the lens has come in the diameter. It is a similar length, but we do have that narrower diameter. So we're still using a 77mm filter thread. It's just over 4.2 inches long, or 107 millimeters. We're down to a 3 1/3 inches diameter, or 84.7 millimeters, and it comes in at 1.41 pounds or 642 grams. Now, it is a similar length to the Mark I, but it is a smaller diameter, especially when we get near the camera. And that becomes exceptionally important if we're using this lens in conjunction with one of Sony's compact full-frame cameras, because that gives us plenty of room to get our knuckles in over that grip and not be scraping our knuckles on a wide, fat lens. So that narrowing, especially at that point, is especially useful on this lens. Now, if we take a look at the specifications between the 85mm 1.4 G Master Mark I, the Mark II, and Sigma lens, you can see the standout feature, apart from now matching the weight of that Sigma, is its use of dual linear XD focus motors. This provides 7 times faster AF tracking than the original Mark I lens, and that is going to be really important for photographers who are looking to track moving subject matter. As I said, 7 times faster AF tracking, and that's courtesy of those linear XD focus motors, which also gives it much quieter AF than the original Mark I lens. And so if you are tracking fast action, and here's some examples captured with the Mark II lens, it does track with my Alpha 1 camera with no issues, as you can see from these images where I've got the dog's eyes pin sharp as it moves very rapidly towards this bouncing ball. Of course, it does have to provide the fast AF, because all of the late model G Master lenses has to be able to keep up with the Alpha 9 III shooting 120 frames per second. And I've reviewed that camera with a variety of lenses, and I will probably get around to putting this lens on an Alpha 9 III when I next get my opportunity. For this review period, however, I was testing it with my Alpha 1 at 20 frames per second, and as you can see from these examples, it does in fact keep up with my Alpha 1, no issues, even in low light, which is especially important. So I'm using F1.4 aperture, 20 frames per second, capturing. The sun is already set, so I'm picking up with some very low light here now with accurate tracking. As you can see from these examples, we're pretty much heading in towards night now whilst working with this prime lens. So I'll put up some examples on my Flickr Pro account so you can check the accuracy of the focus in these instances. Now, some other improvements over not only the Mark I but other competing lenses is there's a minimal focus breathing on this lens, but it's also compatible with Sony's focus breathing compensation, which obviously is only applicable if you're using Sony's lenses. So there is significant focus breathing on the Sigma lens, and we also have linear response MF, and this is going to be really important again for videographers shooting movies, because if you set 2 points between a focus pull, you're reliably going to go between those same 2 points by turning the focus ring manually. You're not going to get any variations as you try shooting that clip on repeated attempts. Now, figure ground separation, background blur, bokeh, this is really why we're going into a prime rather than using a 2.8 zoom. We're looking for maximum pop from the subject, lifting off the background. We're getting more bokeh by shooting at these super wide apertures. Now, with the Mark II, it fits nicely in between two other popular focal lengths, and that is the 51.2. There is a smaller, lighter 1.4 G Master in that 50mm. But if you're looking for maximum bokeh, then you will lean towards that 1.2 lens. If you're going for shorter focal lengths, you really need those wider apertures. Otherwise, you're going to have to stand very, very close to your subject matter to be able to compete with the 85 1.4 and the 135 1.8. Now, cashed up photographers and pros are probably going to choose all three of these. Amateurs may cherry pick their best choice of lens, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we can choose the best wide aperture prime to go for. Now, you can achieve that figure ground separation with a 35mm lens. Here's the 1.4 G Master here. Now, I am going to have to stand very close, and I will use this 35mm focal length when I'm in amongst crowds at demonstrations or parades. Now, I am so close to this guy, I could reach out my left hand and put it onto his shoulder. You are basically in somebody's personal space when shooting this. So this often requires that you have a short conversation with somebody before you start taking their portrait. So with the 50mm, you're one step back from that 35mm focal length, but the people you're photographing with a 50mm to get that figure ground separation, they are going to be aware of your presence. They're going to see you out of their peripheral vision. So most of the portraits you get in these crowd type situations, the person is going to be looking at you because you're half a step inside of their personal space with that 50mm focal length. The 85mm just allows you to step slightly out of their personal space, and you get a much more relaxed portrait sitter, photographer sitter type relationship. And this is often why they call the 85mm focal length the portrait prime, because for many photographers this is the optimum focal length for shooting head and shoulder portraits without making the sitter feel uncomfortable with your presence. So if I back up a little bit, so I'm shooting half length portraits, I'm still going to get that figure ground separation because we're using a longer focal length than maybe 35 or 50mm. So as you can see here, again, low ambient light. You can see the car headlights shining in the background there, and I'm walking across a pedestrian crossing. Notice this woman wearing this green scarf coming the opposite way. So it's picked up focus and tracked it across my field of view really quite accurately. And we're getting really good figure ground separation still. So if I move a little bit further back to 3/4 length portraits, you can still see we've got ample figure ground separation from the 85mm 1.4 lens. I know some photographers would have preferred a 1.2, but for me, I would prefer to be working with that lighter form factor for street photography. If we back up a little bit more, often people now are not aware of your presence, especially if we're using the monitor rather than the finder. You're going to be able to get some candid street photography with that 85mm focal length. If people are slightly distracted, they're really not going to be aware of your presence with this focal length lens. I will use the 135 focal length, especially at sporting events where I am unable to get really close. I'd have to wade into the water to get this particular shot if with a 50mm or 85mm. So that 135 gives you ample figure ground separation. In fact, it gives you the best figure ground separation of the 50 1.2 and 85 1.4, because that longer focal length does narrow the depth of field significantly. So again, with that 135, where I'm going to step back to create a sports action type scenarios, I will be leaning towards that 135. This is actually a cropped 135. Sometimes when the fast action, it's going to be unpredictable. Shooting slightly wide and then cropping in with a 135 is probably your workflow. And I'll also take that 135 into maybe rainforest for shooting birds, because that gives me the optimum wide aperture and slightly long telephoto length. Again, looking back at that Mark I lens, some people will probably still look for that lens because it will probably be heavily discounted. I suspect Sony won't discontinue it straight away, so we are going to be looking at some good discount prices. It is going to be still a good choice for people who want to maybe photograph more static subjects rather than fast moving subjects. There were a few weaknesses with this one, which I need to point out. There were some color aberrations, which is common for a lot of ultra wide aperture prime lenses. So let's take a look at that. This is captured with the 85 1.4. Again, you can see beautiful figure ground separation, beautiful bokeh from this Mark I lens. So this hasn't rendered this lens completely useless just because we now have sharper, lighter, faster Mark II version. But I'll show you by zooming in to 200%, there is a little bit of color fringing present there. For many people, I would have to point that out. It's a little bit of green fringing, a little bit of purple fringing, especially noticeable with some bright highlights going against some darker backgrounds there. Probably more obvious in this one. If I zoom in to 200%, you'll see a little bit of green fringing on the shoulder there and a little bit of magenta fringing around the hot highlight areas of that microphone. Again, you really have to zoom in to notice this, but you do need to be aware that many ultra wide aperture primes do have this color fringing. It is possible to fix this in post-production editing. In Lightroom, for instance, we can just put an eyedropper onto that color fringing and just click on it to remove it, and in 9 times out of 10 it removes quite easily. There is a tiny little bit of color fringing on the Mark II, probably less than on the Mark I, but it is there. Again, I've had to zoom in to 200%. We get a small sense that there's a little bit of green coloration above that 0 point as we go out of focus at maximum aperture. Again, it's not going to be a huge issue for most photographers, but I do need to point out it is there with the Mark II. Here is a great example, though, is for most people that Mark I lens for shooting portraits is still going to be a great choice of lens. And as we zoom in, it is outstandingly sharp. Now, the Mark II is even sharper, but we are splitting hairs for many photographers, especially when we're not have the option to zoom in or we're not printing 6 feet wide prints. That Mark I is still going to hold up in sharpness, as you can see from this particular shot here. Beautifully sharp, very shallow depth of field. Some of the weaknesses that I need to point out with that Mark I lens is the aperture of that Mark I didn't breathe wider in AFS to assist focus acquisition. Most lenses in AFS, the single focus mode, they do breathe wider just to ease focus acquisition. I've got a little video to showcase a lens that does breathe wider in AFS. As we half press, it just breathes wider just so it can lock on. So this is especially important maybe working in darkened studios and you stop down to F8 or F11. That does help focus acquisition. And the Mark I didn't actually do that, making it a little bit difficult for studio photographers who are stopped down to F8 or F11. Let's come back to that lineup again. We've got the 50 1.2 released in 2021, the 135 released in 2019, and a little bit late to the party, but now we have that 85 1.4 G Master II in 2024. And I think if you were only going to choose one of these, I think for a good figure ground separation in a light form factor, the 85mm is really going to be your optimum choice because it is the lightest of these 3 lenses with excellent figure ground separation. If we are going to talk about alternative options, then there are going to be quite a few out there. So it's really what your priorities are. Now, I have said that the 85 G Master Mark II does have those dual linear XT focus motors. So it's going to be the optimum choice for many photographers where the subject matter is actually moving. Now, I've got a chart here of some of the options, so I'll just highlight some of these. There are going to be that 50mm if you just like working a little bit closer than maybe with an 85. That 50mm 1.2 does have excellent figure ground separation. It does come in a little bit heavier, but it does have those fast linear XT focus motors. Now, we do have a cheaper alternative in the 85mm 1.8. It's very light. It uses a small 67mm filter thread. It's very affordable. It does only have that 1.8 aperture, and it does have a smaller number of blades, which will have a small impact on the smoothness of the bokeh, in that it has 9 aperture blades instead of 11 there. If we take a look at just the 1.4s, you've got that the 85mm 1.4 G Master Mark II, which is got the faster focus and the lighter, smaller form factor of the Mark I. We've still got Sigma's 85mm 1.4. Perhaps the focus isn't quite as quick, a little bit more focus breathing on that particular lens, and then we have a really cheap alternative in that Samyang AF, and you might not get as much weather sealing, and you're dropping down back to that 9 aperture blades on that Samyang 85 1.4 lens. Now, again, looking for a better bit of bokeh, as I said, you can actually get that excellent figure ground separation with the 35mm focal length, and I do like my 1.4 G Master for when I'm working very close. This is in a very tight market situation in Vietnam that I'm working with, this 35mm. Most people, however, will feel a little bit more comfortable just by backing up and maybe using a 50mm wide aperture lens, such as the 1.2 or 1.4. You can actually pull that figure ground separation with a 2.8 zoom, as I've outlined here. It's just that you're not going to pull quite as much, and we are standing a little bit close with this 50mm focal length. So most people will probably feel more comfortable using an 85mm portrait prime for that figure ground separation. As I'm showing in this one, you can get really good figure ground separation with a 1.8 85mm. You just have to step a little bit closer to really blur the background with an 85 1.8. But in these illustrations, you can see that we can get rid of distractions in the background with a prime, so much more than maybe with a 2.8 zoom. Now, this is an 85mm 1.8 on an APS-C crop sensor camera here. So we can see that we can get sort of a 135mm full frame equivalent angle of view with an 85mm on an APS-C camera. I do love my 135. It is a little bit chunky and it is a little bit heavy for me when I choose to travel very, very light, but it is an excellent lens, as I've showcased before. In fact, it's one of the near most optically perfect lenses that Sony have ever designed. If you move in very close for Head and Shoulders portrait, the background becomes silky smooth. For some people, you might say that it's actually too much bokeh because you're only going to get maybe one of those two eyes absolutely critically sharp when working this close with a 135 1.8. Now, one of the lenses that I have been using whilst waiting for the 85 1.4 is this Batis 2.8 135, because it does have that smaller form factor that it's down to 1.35 pounds or 614 grams. Because we have that slightly longer focal length, that 2.8 aperture still gives you plenty of figure ground separation, as you can see from these particular examples I'm showcasing that are captured with that Batis 135 lens. It does have reasonably fast autofocus, and it also has optical steady shot, so it is quite a good choice for people looking for that 135 focal length, looking for a smaller form factor. It's a very sort of rare lens, that 135 2.8. Most people are going for the much wider 1.8 option, but I would probably balance that is, would you choose the Batis 2.8 135 or an 85 1.4 if you're looking for good figure ground separation in a smaller form factor. Now the 85mm GM II is smaller than the Batis 135 but 1 ounce heavier. Its advantage over the Batis is that it has the option to be either an 85 1.4 or a 127.5mm f2.1 if used in APS-C mode. I know a lot of photographers don't like using APS-C mode or Super 35 mode on their cameras. They don't like to crop in camera, but with many of the megapixel rich cameras, it is an option either to crop in camera or just crop in post to get that narrower angle of view. Here, cropping in post-production to get that narrower angle of view. And we've got 20 megapixels, so we've still got plenty of megapixels, given there's only 8.3 megapixels on a 4K monitor. So this does allow us to crop even tighter in some instances when we're using maybe an Alpha 1 or an Alpha 7R camera. Here we're getting a 2.25 times crop, so that takes out the 85mm to a 191.25 full frame equivalent angle of view. And so if we're just looking to output a 4K image and we don't want to be shooting with a 7200, it is possible to crop quite tightly on megapixel rich cameras, as I'm showcasing in this particular example where I have cropped to a 4K image. One of the advantages for me perhaps over that Batis 135 is I do have those dual linear XT focus motors. We do have quite a fast focusing lens on that Batis, but of course the advantage of this 85 is if my subject matter is closer or we're working in very low light, and I've got the advantage of that 1.4 aperture to lock on focus reliably and track in quite dim conditions here. I think the 85 is going to find a home in my personal camera bag. I like a lot of Sony lenses, but that doesn't mean to say I always add them to my personal gear. But as I release this particular lens review, I will be traveling with the 85mm 1.4 G Master II. Sony have allowed me to take away a pre-production version of this lens, and also the 2450 f2.8 G, just to keep a light camera bag as I'm traveling in Europe this year. Just remember, I do have a very comprehensive alpha support channel. Just head over to patreon.com/Margala, where I have ebooks, Q&A forums, member-only seminars. I make all of my raw files available from my camera lens review. I also have camera setup files for late model cameras. Now, I do support most of the late model Sony Alpha cameras pretty much since the A7 III camera here. So you should find the ebook that you're looking for, and most of these are over 500 and 600 pages long. And as I said, I do have 1 and 2 hour seminars. Now you can take out a subscription or you can buy some of these products from the shop on patreon.com. Thanks for watching. Give me a thumbs up and make sure you follow me on patreon.com, and I'll catch you online next time.